Wonderful, thank you. So a very warm welcome to this session, which is hosted by the Centre for International Policy Research in Qatar and by Wilton Park. And Wilton Park is a think space of the UK government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I'm Allison, Hilliard, our Programme Director at Wilton Park. And what a pleasure to be with you here in Doha. Thank you for giving us your time this morning for a very important session. This morning we are going to be discussing the role of faith leaders in defending the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Now let me just start by reminding you and putting that into context. At the outset, the UN Charter talks about a determination to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and in the worth of the human person. And it commits the peoples of the United Nations to practice tolerance and to live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. Goodness, that was 1945, signed by representatives of 50 different countries. And here we are today, 80 years on, in a world of rising conflict and division and polarisation. And that has been so much the theme of the forum over the last few days. So you might ask then, what have faith leaders to do with this? Well, in September, in a report to the United Nations, the Secretary General said that ethical and spiritual foundations of religion and beliefs have this essential role to play in addressing the polarisation and the conflicts that disfigure our world today, an essential role to play in contributing to reconciliation. He pointed to a recent Wilton Park dialogue, which I chaired, on just that, the role and the responsibility of religious leaders in times of war, polarisation and conflict. So that's what we're going to be unpacking for the next 45 minutes. So I'm delighted to be joined by 5 eminent thinkers who are going to take us through this tricky issue of the role of religious leaders in conflict. Let me introduce them in turn. So at the end, Fadi Daou, you are very welcome, Fadi. So Executive Director of Globethics, and Fadi, well known for your work in interfaith and inclusive citizenship and in defending freedom of religion and belief. Welcome. Edward Kessler, who's sitting in the middle. Ed, welcome. A leading thinker in interfaith relations and the founder and president of the Woolf Institute in the UK, which focuses on relations between Jews, Christians and Muslims. And then Imam Omar Suleiman, delighted to have you with us, a world-renowned Islamic scholar, activist for human rights, and the founder and president of the Muslim think tank, the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. Peter Mandaville. Peter, thank you for joining us. So Senior Fellow at Georgetown University's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and serving in senior positions at the US Department of State, the US Institute of Peace and USAID, but all focused on that role of religion in diplomacy and religion in global affairs. And then finally, Jane Kinnimont. Thank you very much, Jane, for being with us on stage. So Chief Executive of the United Nations Association in the UK and strategic thinker on peace and security in our changing world order. Fadi, may I start with you? I'd like to take you to the conclusions of that Wilton Park dialogue that was referenced by the Secretary General to spell out for us what you think the responsibility is of religious leaders and faith actors in rebuilding trust and in promoting reconciliation. And I suppose what you think practically they can do as well as their responsibility. Fadi.
Thank you, Allison. I'm delighted to be here also, and delighted to see this topic being discussed at the Doha Forum, probably for the first year, and I hope that it will take also a greater place in the discussions about global governance. The UN Charter can be summarized in 2 words. It's ensuring peace and human dignity and rights for all. And so the question is, do faith actors and religious leaders have a role in this? Definitely yes, as you mentioned in the introduction. And I would like to start by this maybe message of hope, saying that not only yes in principle, but also yes in practice. And there are some religious leaders who are practicing this role and these responsibilities. And here I would like to refer again to this important dialogue that was convened by Wilton Park with Globethics and other partners, 40 religious leaders and faith actors from different backgrounds, Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic, with other policymakers. We call this multi-stakeholder diplomacy for peace, gathered together, and they were able to state 19 points in a public statement that I invite you all, in fact, to look at the statement at the website of Wilton Park, where they collectively, in fact, agreed on a set of definition of this responsibility of faith actors. And I would like to refer to few of those key points from the statements that answers your question, Allison, how practically faith leaders can really contribute to supporting this principle of peace and human dignity and rights for all, and especially in times of increased conflict, wars, atrocities as we have been witnessing these years. So in the statement, the first 3 points or 3 commitments in the statement from those faith actors focuses on the following. First, recognizing publicly that everyone's life is sacred. And unfortunately, I would say we need to go back to this very basic foundation of being together, that everyone's life is sacred. And so this goes against the dehumanizations that we have been witnessing these days in the context of wars and conflict. And then the second very important, I think, recognition from those faith actors is to acknowledge the hurt and suffering of all people and communities. So to move from a victimization positioning, so I'm the victim and the other is a persecutor or is responsible of the situation, to recognize that the hurt is on all sides and the responsibility of faith leaders is to deal with this situation and suffering on all sides. And the consequences of this, in fact, so how to move to resolving those situations or contributing to resolve those conflict situations and sufferings is first by working to understand the deep roots of cyclical violence, and then to create innovative spaces for mediation, hope, and healing. And I'm starting by this statement and those points from the statement because I think through those words we can find condensed, I would say, the main elements of responsibility, not only of faith actors, I would say, of all societal actors, including also public and political actors together.
Thank you, Fadi, very much. I mean, Ed, could I possibly move to you now? I mean, Fadi has outlined to us a responsibility to recognize the sacredness of life, to provide a space for healing and for reconciliation, and also to understand the deep roots of conflict. But how do you see the role of faith leaders? Because I'm very aware that faith leaders look to their own community, and yet this statement is asking them to look out to the other, to communities other than their own. So how would you see the role and responsibility of faith leaders here?
Thank you, Allison, and great pleasure to be here with you all. One of the ways I'd answer it, and to complement what Fadi had to say, was the requirement for faith leaders to do what we're doing, which is to cross boundaries. And by crossing boundaries, we model what it is to reach out rather than retreat within. The temptation of our communities when we feel under pressure is to retreat within. But actually, whether they're local faith leaders, national or international faith leaders, the first visit of Pope Leo was to Turkey. An important example of somebody who's willing to engage in this case, dialogue with a Muslim country. When we were celebrating the anniversary of Nostra Aetate in Rome, Vatican II 60th anniversary, it was clear that the new Pope was walking in the footsteps of Pope Francis. So the first thing is the crossing the boundaries and modeling that. The second, and taking Fadi's point to the local, is how important it is to build local networks. at a time when we tend to be fearing polarization, fearing one another, to build local networks, to see the Woolf Institute research shows that the transfer starts from the bottom up rather than the top down, that building those local networks, visiting synagogues, visiting mosques, visiting churches, places of worship belonging to somebody else, breaks down those barriers, builds up the sense of trust and reconciliation. In the UK, for example, we had a terrible fire at Grenfell in West London, and the local state, the local council was unable to provide for people, so it was the local mosque, Al-Manar Mosque, it was the local church that provided the shelter, the clothing, the soup kitchens, and so on. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the local. And this is, if you like, the opposite. If an event happens or you have a disaster, a trauma occurring in Gaza, for example, or in Kashmir, for example, it transfers to the streets of the local very quickly, whether it's Dallas or whether it's Leicester. So since things happen on the global level, that is, the global affects the local, let's reverse it. Let's have the local affect the global. And the third point I'd like to make in these times is to recognize the extremism within our own communities. I'm a Jew. Of course I'm going to be opposed to anti-Semitism, but I need allies to help me fight anti-Semitism. And in fact, Christians and Muslims can do more to fight anti-Semitism than Jews. Likewise, Islamophobia. Of course, my neighbor on the right, Omar, is going to be fighting Islamophobia. He's a Muslim. He faces Islamophobia in Dallas. But he's going to find it more easy as his co-religion is fighting Islamophobia when he has allies in the Christian and the Jewish community. The hated cannot overcome hatred. We need allies to overcome the prejudices that we face. And religious leaders have a responsibility to reach out across boundaries, to reach out to allies in other communities, because frankly, we have to hang together than hang one by one.
Thank you, Ed. That's a good point to bring in, Imam Omar. Is that how you would see the role of faith actors and religious leaders working at the local primarily, or from your experience, what role do you think faith leaders play in promoting reconciliation, Imam Omar?
Wonderful. So I think that I'm glad that you're actually pivoting to local when you speak to me, because I do feel like good local models actually can inform any type of global roadmap that we want to have work for faith communities across the board. I think it's very hard to implement anything that is ignorant or does not take into consideration the circumstances of various populations and different types of legislations that affect the religious communities that dwell in these areas. So I'll speak from a U.S. perspective, but I'll actually start from a very local context. I'll talk about New Orleans, Louisiana, which is where I was born. I tend to break, productive multi-faith engagement, interfaith dialogue into three categories. The first one being shared responsibility. And I think that that's where powerful trust is built, and it tends to be in the realm of charity, so there isn't much in terms of controversy there. It's just a matter of us championing the best of our values. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, Louisiana, I was there. The death toll was on par with September 11, but because it directly ties into government failure, in the case of New Orleans, it was quickly sort of swept under the rug and not spoken about in terms of, the U.S.'s role in terms of building community, especially when community's been destroyed by failed government policy. In New Orleans, Louisiana, the city was rebuilt primarily by faith communities, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, others that came together to rebuild our houses of worship, to rebuild our communities, to fill in the void where the government had failed us. And it is one of the most inspiring stories that has never really been told at the global level, where you had faith communities rebuild one of America's great cities. I was blessed to be a part of that. So I've seen it within the realm of shared responsibility. When you're in shared responsibility, you don't feel like you're compromising anything of your faith's tenets. In fact, you feel like you are shining the light on the most beautiful values of your faith. You're almost competing in good, right? You want to show how the doctrine of charity and being neighborly and all of these values that we would, I'm sure, say are shared across our faiths, come to uniquely be prominent within our own traditions. The second category, the second bucket, gets a little bit more tense, and it's shared moral concern. And this is where faith communities end up sort of being at odds with societies that are becoming more secular, right? But I think that faith communities tend to have very similar shared societal concerns, moral concerns, and that usually means that you're looking at the way legislation is playing out as it affects especially religious minorities. And I think that there's an incredible amount of room there for faith communities to work together, especially in the West, especially in the US context, where we can protect our faith communities as a whole, in these societies. The third one is where it gets most tense, which is shared moral commitments, coalitions that are built around shared moral commitments. This is where you are challenging government, where you are challenging society, where you are showing why we're supposed to be faith leaders in the first place. If we can't stand on truth, then how can we call ourselves faith leaders? If we shift with geopolitical winds or we shift with societal trends, how can we, wear that garb with sincerity when we're not willing to challenge gross moral injustices as we see them playing out? And so whether this means standing against, racism or standing against fascist policies or standing against, things that would affect the most vulnerable amongst us, whether they're faithful or faithless, whether they belong to our communities or not, this is where you start to see things become very tense. And especially when those shared moral commitments, those coalitions that are built around shared moral commitments serve as a filtration of sorts, where, faith leaders find themselves shackled in such a way that they can't speak to the most basic injustices, obvious injustices to any moral human being, decent human being in the world. And so when you talk about Gaza, for example, and the Gaza moment, yes, there's been a lot of fracturing. I can tell you many faith leaders that I've worked with in the past that I haven't spoken to in the last 2 years, or that have sent me text messages and said in private, I agree with you, but I can't say anything in public. And I say, well, that kind of contradicts the whole basis of our arrangement in the first place. But I can also tell you that there's something deeply inspiring about rabbis staging sit-ins at Union Station because of the genocide, in opposition to the genocide. And the way things are going in the US right now, I wouldn't be surprised if Jewish Voice for Peace gets designated as an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know where things are actually going, but I would say that shared moral commitments demand of us a certain level of courage, moral courage, and that's where faith leaders can actually lead, where society lags on the basis of consistent values, on the basis of consistent human dignity, and speaking up for the vulnerable, no matter who the vulnerable it is, whether they're forgotten or whether they are intentionally erased. I have to mention this. I just met this incredible woman who's a Rohingya refugee who mentioned the plight of the Rohingya. How many faith leaders have come together to address the plight of the Rohingya? It's just not juicy enough politically. It doesn't tie into anyone's agenda neatly. Well, that's exactly where faith leaders are supposed to stand up and say, well, this needs to be an issue of global concern and not neglected and not forgotten.
Thank you very much indeed. We will return to Gaza and interfaith and what that means and the response that there has been since the 7th of October and what that means for faith leaders in just a minute. But Jane, let me bring you in. From where you sit, if you remember what happened 80 years ago with faith leaders standing up to defend human rights and standing up to speak out for the UN Charter, do you think this is a moment of opportunity for faith leaders to be showing that lead that Imam Omar has just talked about?
I think it's a moment of opportunity and necessity to really bring in the ethical dimension into our politics, and that faith leaders and broader civil society, including people who would identify as humanists but feel a deep sense of ethical purpose and responsibility, do need to stand up on the basis of shared moral commitments. I mean, I'm glad that you started, Allison, with the UN Charter. It's a fascinating document because on one hand, it's a legal text that creates obligations and is a foundation of international law, but it's also a set of moral commitments. And it's a set of moral commitments that humanity has never managed to fully implement or live up to. It talks about peace for the sake of succeeding generations and working together for the advancement of all peoples on a basis of equality between peoples, between men and women, and between nations. And we have to decide really whether we take those aspirations to be serious things that we work towards, or things that we're kind of embarrassed by and think are impossible. And that is basically a human choice. And it seems very easy for political leaders to say that these are essentially meaningless words without really taking on board that the sort of moral and ethical dimension can be a deep source of power and purpose. And also that without those, you don't really have a purpose. I mean, the UN just now is in a state of deep crisis and transition, and it is cutting its budgets by 20 to 25%. Probably many people would think that it does need to cut its budget. And yet, if that was a body that was advancing and achieving peace in a way that everyone could see, people would probably be prepared to pay twice as much if they could see that progress. And so there is a value to pushing forward to trying to meet these goals, even if we're never going to completely get there. And I think, now we are in quite a deep systemic period of change in international politics, where there is a need to redefine what our responsibilities are towards each other, what we have in common, and to do that in a way that is planetary and that tries to be universal, because we are seeing people retreating into smaller and smaller imaginary communities because they're struggling to imagine and believe in that kind of global solidarity. I'm worried when I look around my own country and some other countries in Europe at what sometimes seems to be a retreat into small-minded versions of nationalism. And I think we need to work with all sorts of ethical and faith leaders to appreciate, yes, we're all rooted in different cultures, backgrounds, beliefs, but in there is something common about what it means to be human and share the planet together. And this is actually an urgent political project and not just something that is abstractly philosophical.
Thank you, Jane. Peter, I suppose for you, is that the urgency now? The urgency, I'm going back to Fadi's point, that the urgency is to speak about the sacredness of all life. So the urgency is to lead the charge in the way that Jane has described. Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I think there's a useful and counterintuitive juxtaposition in the title of this panel, right? Because you don't usually think about faith leaders as being charged with upholding the Charter of the United Nations, right? It's an intergovernmental entity, and usually it's the member states that would be charged with upholding that charter. But one of the most prominent themes at this year's Doha Forum has been this idea of the breakdown of trust in institutions, political elites, systems, mechanisms, and aspirations for justice. And we heard, I think, very powerfully from Francesca Albanese yesterday, the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, that precisely when societal confidence in institutions breaks down, it goes to society to take up the responsibility. And this is where I think there's a transition to thinking about the roles of religious leaders. Because in many societies, religious leaders play, I think, a unique role in terms of the moral voice that they have. A prophetic voice that has the ability to hold power accountable, to ask transformative questions, but only when those religious voices are able to stand apart from power. And more on that in a moment. And this is why I think it's useful to think about these questions in relation to what's currently going on in Israel and Palestine. The 20-point peace plan for Gaza, some of you may be aware, includes this often overlooked point 18 that calls for a new interfaith dialogue to create new understandings between Israelis and Palestinians. And on the one hand, I welcome what that point recognizes, what the inclusion of that point recognizes, which is that beyond political and security arrangements, there is a role for religion and religious leaders in helping to create a new grammar and social fabric for coexistence. But I'm also worried about this point 18 in the Trump peace plan. So in southern Israel right now, we have in the town of Kiryat Gat this warehouse called the Civil Military Coordinating Center. And it's full of American military officers and Israeli military officers and military liaisons from the various countries that will be contributing forces to the International Stabilization Force. And there are internationals and humanitarians, and they are talking about monitoring the ceasefire that isn't really a ceasefire. They're talking about coordinating humanitarian aid that isn't actually getting in, and they're talking about the reconstruction of Gaza. But you know who isn't in that facility? There are no Palestinians. There are no Palestinians in that conversation. And I worry that we risk repeating those same problems if we rush into an interfaith dialogue, right? We've had over the years since the Abraham Accords, one after another, religious summit where we bring together high-level religious leaders who sit together very comfortably and say very nice things and issue very nice and in some ways welcome statements, but that are completely divorced from the reality of life on the ground in conflict zones. And so my concern about rushing into a new interfaith dialogue right now is that we do so in a way that simply reinforces and recreates the existing power relations and geopolitical agendas rather than tapping into the potential transformative power of the religious leader voice.
Thank you, Peter. I suppose it's worth dwelling on point 18 for a moment and worth dwelling on interfaith dialogue. Fadi, perhaps I could come to you for your thoughts as to whether, in fact, point 18 and the call for interfaith dialogue is, in fact, an opportunity for interfaith dialogue. I mean, let's face it, when the 7th of October happened, and since then with the war in Gaza, most interfaith dialogue stopped. Religious leaders did not speak to each other. Omar, you mentioned that silence that there was from good initiatives that had built up over the years. So whether this is an opportunity for, if you like, interfaith dialogue to come of age and have something valuable to say and to reinvent itself, or whether that's too optimistic a view. Fadi.
Indeed, religious leaders and faith actors are part of their people and their communities. And it's a trap to think about them like disconnected from what happens and what is happening to their own people. So they suffer with their people. And they are perceived also that they are perpetrators when the other side is also perceived responsible of the violence. And I think the legitimacy and even the effectiveness of the engagement of religious leaders in dialogue needs this reality that they are part of their people and they bring the voice of their people. And unfortunately, sometimes the suffering is so strong that this voice can be silenced because there is no words in certain situations of suffering. However, there is always a responsibility, and I think Imam Omar was mentioning this shared moral responsibility. And I think this paradox that religious leaders need to deal with, at the same time representing their own communities, their own people, bring the voice of their people to have this legitimacy and not to be, as Peter mentioned, like participating in summits that are completely ineffective. So effectiveness needs to bring the voice of the people. And this voice always now, it's more and more challenging voice are on the table. But at the same time, being able to represent that people and to represent the shared moral responsibility. So being ethical leaders. And this is somehow quite unique of religious leaders because they are spiritual leaders, so they are responsible of our common ethical base and understanding and representative of the suffering and the needs of their own communities and people. And I do believe as far as religious leaders would embody those two missions and two responsibilities, interreligious dialogue and interfaith engagement can, I think, gain a new momentum. I would like to end by quoting Pope Leo. At the end of his visit to Lebanon after Turkey, the very last words of his visit in his farewell message at the airport of Beirut, he said the following: "We must recognize that armed struggle brings no benefit. While weapons are lethal, negotiation, mediation, and dialogue are constructive. Let us all choose peace as a way and not just as a goal." And I think this is a call for all religious leaders now to be involved in those three areas: negotiation, mediation, and dialogue, but again, with the condition to embody at the same time their own community's needs and also their ethical and spiritual leadership and responsibility.
Thank you, Fadi. Ed, would you share that plea that there's an opportunity here now, but an urgency to be authentic?
Yes. There is an urgency, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now. And I think we all face that, the urgency of the present moment. And that urgency isn't about securing uniformity. There's sometimes a temptation amongst religious leaders to believe that unity is uniformity. It's not. Unity is about allowing for diversity of opinions within communities and across communities. And one of the reasons why so many dialogue groups have collapsed in the last couple of years, certainly in the UK when we've looked at the reasons, is because there's been an attempt to agree on everything. It's not possible. To create a statement, for example, on Gaza has not been possible for so many groups, so they've collapsed. So to recognize that there are diverse views, there are contradictory views, there are fundamentally divergent views, does not mean you stop talking. Every conflict, every war has to end in a conversation. So the conversation needs to start now. And religious leaders have an absolutely vital role in that conversation. And also, something that we're not very good at is recognizing the extremism within our own communities. I find it much easier engaging in dialogue with other communities when I recognize the dirty laundry within my own. I'm taken more seriously, as are my colleagues. This willingness to be self-critical. Now, if I can't be self-critical 3,000 miles away in my ivory tower of Cambridge, how can I expect somebody in Gaza, or somebody in southern Israel, or somebody in Kashmir, in Pakistan, in India, wherever it is, to engage in dialogue, to recognize different positions if I'm unable to do that in the comfort of my home? So don't seek one voice, recognize that there are multiple voices. And also, just to add, where there are models of excellence. Yesterday, we heard of those who attended the Grenada Declaration. It's one of the best statements I've read on Islamophobia, combating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, produced by an array of people. Now, of course, we have to disseminate, we have to deliver, we have to implement, but there are these models. We should be supporting those models, whether they are local, whether they are in the region where the conflict is, particularly those examples of good practice, and encourage those rather than simply engage from the sidelines in a megaphone voice rather than the voice of dialogue.
Thank you, Ed. I wonder, Imam Omar, where you see this going. I mean, Ed talked about recognizing different voices, but goodness, it's not as if every religious leader in every country talks with a voice of peace. I mean, sometimes the voices of religious leaders can do the opposite of that. They can be agents of polarization, and they can be agents to support ethno-nationalist divide. So how to go forward? We've got this call now for point 18 and a call for an interfaith dialogue. What would you see as an authentic way forward from where you sit?
Yeah, so I think since we bring up, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., peace is the presence of justice, right? It's not the absence of violence. It's not the absence of war. It's not the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And my fear and my skepticism with so many of these dialogues is that they often suffocate calls for justice, and they reinforce false framings that suggest that this was all just because Muslims and Jews just couldn't get along, and that's why you suddenly have an occupation and apartheid that's followed by a genocide and all sorts of tension that exists. You don't want to reinforce false framings, so you want to address issues head on, authentically, I think as Peter mentioned, away from the halls of power, because we are not, as faith leaders, meant to be brokers of power. We're supposed to be examples of conscience, and we're supposed to call people to consistent values of conscience and dignity across the board. And that means that we're going to often find ourselves at odds with many of the interfaith initiatives that are being launched from the halls of power. We often talk about rescuing faith from bad actors, from extremist groups. I also think you need to rescue faith from government sometimes. There's nothing that's a greater assault on our faith, I think, in this present age in terms of putting forth a roadmap than the Abraham Accords. I mean, when I came out against the Abraham Accords and wrote against the Abraham Accords, I was called by pastors and rabbis that I've worked with for years and said, "We're not getting it. What's so wrong about this?" And I said, I just can't imagine Abraham would stand for arms deals and apartheid. For me, you launch the Abraham Accords when you see Sha'ban, a young Palestinian, connected to an IV, burning in a hospital tent while the Super Bowl is going on in 2024. If that's not more emblematic of Abraham than anything else, then I don't know what is. And that's where we come together as Abrahamic voices, as people of Abraham, peace be upon him, and we say, no, enough is enough. And I think that there are great interfaith initiatives and multi-faith initiatives that are forming organically outside of the halls of power. And, we've used this term, decolonizing interfaith and decolonizing multi-faith work, that allows us to actually be authentic, because you have to capture the imagination, the real imagination of the people, the real pain of the people, and then give it a divine language. Give it a divine shared moral responsibility, and be consistent. Challenge your own community. So when any community, when any group of people are being harmed, even if it's by our own, people that wear our garb, we stand together and we say, no, we stand on the basis of consistent moral values, and beyond what's on a piece of paper, we believe in human dignity, in shared human dignity. That does not require us to give up anything of our faith. We can be authentic theologically. We can be authentic with the pain that we feel that's being inflicted upon us, but we can also be courageous in challenging the pain that is being inflicted by people that wear the same garb as us. But we are the Gaza generation. You can't get away from Gaza right now. It is the great moral issue of our time. Young people see it. There's, I can tell you that across the board in the United States, across religious communities, it's actually pretty consistent that you see young people that are standing up together, and that's not as a particular panelist at this forum suggested because TikTok is brainwashing them. It's because they're seeing children being shredded to pieces, and they're outraged by that and morally enraged, and we have to give that a divine language and a divine shared responsibility, then transfer that to other conflicts, those that are forgotten and those that have become polarizing because it's always my group versus yours. Consistency can only come out of integrity. Integrity can only come out of a sense of independence.
Thank you. Thank you. So two views on that. So moment of opportunity for religious leaders to do what you've just said, or actually a chance for countries to abdicate their responsibility and be giving it over to religious leaders. So Jane and then Peter.
Absolutely. I think that interfaith dialogue can be an important element of peace building, but there is a risk of overloading the expectations on what religious leaders can do. And in this context of Israel and Palestine, interfaith dialogue is not going to address the occupation or the issues of rights and inequalities. It's not going to stop torture in prisons. It's going to foster some understanding. But there are a lot of problems that will need to be solved politically. And in my own experience, I come from a city in the UK, Glasgow, which has a long history of tension between Catholics and Protestants. And that has really been transformed for my generation. It hasn't completely gone away, but it has really, really been reduced. But that's largely thanks to the fact that the conflict over Northern Ireland was reduced. It's not been totally resolved, but it has been improved and managed through a political agreement. Recently, I enjoyed a chance to meet some young people engaged in interfaith dialogue in the UK with a group called the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine. And that includes young Catholics and Protestants from Northern Ireland who were people that were born after the Good Friday Agreement, but we're still living with the inheritance of these tensions and mistrust. And they're talking now to Muslim and Jewish British counterparts, saying to them, you know, it's never going to completely go away. But you can begin by getting some empathy and getting some understanding. But unwinding and fixing this stuff takes a very, very long time and a lot of political effort, not just the societal reconciliation, but actually fixing the political drivers of the problem.
Thanks, Jane. Peter.
So I think this point of recognizing the limits of what's expected of religious leaders in, for example, the Israel-Palestine context is very important, right? The calls for interfaith dialogue now are coming from those who are structurally advantaged within the conflict context. Palestinians aren't asking for interfaith dialogue. I don't know what interfaith dialogue would mean to a Gazan today. I don't know what interfaith dialogue would mean to a West Bank Palestinian being harassed and beaten up by Israeli settlers, right? And so that's where I think we need to be tempered and realistic in our expectations. And of course, religion, you know, the very aspects of religion that make it such a powerful force for bringing people together can be flipped around and be turned into a very significant force for dehumanizing. And this has been a problem in the American context, right? You know, Christian Zionists have been, you know, the leading edge of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. Anti-Semitism, and I mean genuine anti-Semitism, not just legitimate criticism of the state of Israel. We have to make that distinction because anti-Semitism has been weaponized now. But genuine anti-Semitism has been a problem within American Muslim communities. And yet at the same time, there are hopeful things that have happened. I think, you know, Ed and Imam Omar have mentioned a couple examples of them. Back during the first Trump administration, there were efforts in the US Congress to begin scrutinizing and shutting down the activities of humanitarian organizations such as Islamic Relief USA. This is a $100 million organization that does crucially important support work around the world. And you know who got around them to support and serve as allies? Were conservative humanitarian groups like World Vision, the Christian humanitarian organization World Vision, HIAS, the Jewish faith-based resettlement agency. And with the current climate around the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood and the likely knock-on effects on a wide range of American Muslim humanitarian and charitable organizations, that kind of allyship, interfaith, multi-faith, is going to be crucial once again.
Thank you, Peter. Let's just have a final round, and to be brief from our panel, we're almost out of time. So Fadi, if I could start with you. Where do you sit then? Is this a moment of opportunity for faith actors to really step up to the crisis we find ourselves in at the moment? Do you share some of the reservations that we've heard from Jane and from Peter?
Unfortunately, our humanity, at least if we look at the 20th century and 21st century, needs sometimes catastrophic situation to learn from them. The United Nations was born after World War II, League of Nations after the First War, but also the Christian faith has been completely transformed after the Shoah, you know, and the perception of the other and the responsibility vis-à-vis the others also. So I do believe that we are living now a momentum, a transformative momentum, a momentum where either if we continue as usual, doing business as usual, including an interfaith engagement and dialogue, we will be completely marginalized and lose the impact on our societies. And if we take this moment as a transformative moment, as a real momentum, and accept that this momentum transforms us, transforms our way of doing things, including interreligious engagement and faith actors, their social responsibility of faith actors, then we need a new paradigm, I would say, of interreligious dialogue and engagement for peace. And this paradigm, as I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, going back to the statement of Wilton Park, should be based on the sacredness of a human life and the common responsibility of all believers in saving every human life while staying very committed to their own faith.
Imam Omar, moment of opportunity for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in the United States, I can say that, you know, prior to 2023, when any synagogue comes under attack, when any church comes under attack, especially black churches, which have increasingly come under attack, and unfortunately that has not been part of the conversation to the extent that it should be, but in places like Charleston, right, or Sikh Temple in Madison, we've stood together in front of places of worship when any community has been attacked. I will continue to do that. When anyone is attacked, I will stand with that person because I believe in the value of human dignity. I won't ask their political views or how they even feel about my dignity or my people, right, in any way in the tribalistic sense. I'll stand with you when your rights are being violated. I will stand for your dignity no matter how much I disagree with you. But I will also challenge you and challenge every component of society to hold themselves to consistency. It's been a very, very, very painful 2 years. As a Palestinian American imam, I can tell you that I received condolences quietly when Wadir al-Fayoumi, the young 6-year-old Palestinian boy, was hacked to death 26 times by a military blade, and his mother almost killed as well. And some of the same people that were justifying the murder of Palestinian children in Gaza were texting me and saying, we're very sorry and this should never happen. And I said, it shouldn't happen here, it shouldn't happen there. It shouldn't happen here, it shouldn't happen there. What's the difference between Wadir and myself, who happens to be a child of Palestinian refugees that was born in the United States, or a Palestinian who never made it out of Gaza? What's the difference between us? You can't fragment our humanity or our identity when we have not done that ourselves. And so it's just about consistency. How do we hold everyone accountable to consistent principles without becoming tools and instruments of powers, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, that consistently use those instruments for evil?
Thank you. I'll have a brief comment then from Ed and from Jane and from Peter.
So I would join you, Omar, and condemn that sort of brutality and killing of Palestinian children in Gaza. As a Jew, as a Jewish leader, I feel ashamed. I would also say, as it will be my final few words, that we have to support those initiatives on the ground, particularly in conflict zones, that are trying to reach across divides, that are recognizing the trauma and the tragedy that's been befalling Palestinian people, both Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. When I went on a walk with a Muslim leader in Britain to support St. John's Hospice blindfolded in London, it was to show that a Muslim and a Jew could walk around the streets of London for a Christian charity working in Gaza. We have to have those models of collaboration as well as the courage to condemn brutality, injustice. Finally, to recognize the existential crisis, and you would know as a Palestinian, the Palestinian people feel, but also in Israel, there is an existential crisis. And unless we recognize that the crisis there is there and listen to that from 3,000 miles away, then we won't be able to help them go forward. Final word, Allison. At the very interesting Gaza reconstruction seminar here yesterday or the day before, who were the voices missing? There was no Palestinian voice. There was no Israeli voice. Unless these groups are brought into the conversation, there will not be progress.
Thank you. So let's just have a quick comment. I know we're out of time. I'm getting the eye. Peter and then Jane.
So what I think is that we need to not kind of go into a new interfaith dialogue, but we need to pause and we need to critically examine interfaith dialogue. I remember conversations I've had over the last year with the Palestinian Lutheran pastor Mitri Rahab, in which he said to me, the current paradigm of interfaith dialogue is broken. And I think this is a powerful call, and the fact that it comes from a Palestinian Christian, people who are often left out of the story of the Israel-Palestine conflict, makes it all the more powerful. And so what I think it means is that we need to engage this idea that Imam Omar mentioned of decolonizing interfaith dialogue. It means that we have to look and ask what an interfaith dialogue that is something other than simply a tool for advancing the geopolitical agendas of certain powers and states in the region. What does that mean? What does a socially transformative interfaith dialogue that centers justice actually look like?
Jane.
We're in a time where some of the most powerful countries in the world are treating certain human beings like they're not real, like they're disposable, whether it's Palestinians or Ukrainians or fighting the war on drugs as though it's a video game. And sometimes it comes from a lack of empathy, and sometimes it comes from fear. But there is going to be a need to counter that with actually caring, treating other people as real people that feel things just like us. And some of that can come from faith leaders, but also other kinds of ethical communities, and talking to each other and using our basic empathy and compassion to rebuild those humanitarian principles and belief in human rights.
And that indeed is the heart of the UN Charter, which is where we started our conversation. So thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have time to come to the audience for questions, but there will be plenty of time now over coffee. But I am so pleased to thank our panel for raising some fundamental questions about how we relate to each other, how we share this planet with each other, and for raising some of the very tricky political issues as we look to the next year. So thank you. So Fadi Daou, Jane Kinnimont, Ed Kessler, Peter Mandaville, and Imam Omar, thank you very much indeed.